On a dim, rain-soaked evening in the heart of the city, a lone taxi wound its way through the glistening streets. The driver, a black woman named Lena, kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind barely registering the faint mist curling around her headlights. She was no stranger to long nights behind the wheel, steering through bustling traffic, ferrying strangers to their destinations with calm resilience. But tonight was different. As she made a careful turn onto a quiet street, the sudden flash of blue and red lights shattered the calm, illuminating her rearview mirror like a beacon of dread. Her heart raced, confusion flickering in her eyes as she pulled over, fully aware of the minor nature of her so-called offense. It was barely a blink of an infraction, an oversight that any driver could make, a forgotten signal, a slight delay in a lane change. But when she saw the stern faces of the 4 white officers approaching her car, she felt an unsettling chill. The officer leading the group tapped on her window, his expression a blend of impatience and thinly veiled hostility. "License and registration," he barked, his voice cold and clipped. Lena complied, forcing herself to stay calm. But every fiber of her being sensed something was wrong. This was not a routine stop. She could feel it in the way they hovered around her vehicle, their stares sharp and predatory, as if they had already decided her guilt. "Step out of the vehicle," another officer ordered, his tone leaving no room for questions. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she unbuckled her seatbelt, aware that each movement was being watched, scrutinized. The air was thick with tension, and as she stepped onto the wet pavement, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life, her dignity, and her freedom were balancing precariously on a razor's edge. On a dim, rain-soaked evening, the city seemed to breathe with an uneasy stillness. The air was thick, humid, and laden with the scent of wet concrete and gasoline as droplets cascaded from the sky, glistening under the sparse streetlights. Lena Johnson, a black woman in her early 30s, sat behind the wheel of her taxi, her dark, steady eyes focused on the road ahead, her mind replaying snippets of her day. It had been long, exhausting even, with a continuous stream of passengers and the usual cascade of thankless rides through heavy traffic. But she had finally finished her last fare and was heading home to her husband, David, who would be waiting with a warm smile and words of reassurance. Tonight, the familiar streets seemed somehow ominous, with the heavy rain casting shadows that danced unpredictably across her windshield. The solitude of her late-night drive offered her a rare moment of peace, but it was quickly shattered by the sharp, insistent flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Startled, Lena glanced up, her heartbeat quickening. She hadn't been speeding, and she was certain she hadn't broken any serious traffic laws. She was cautious by nature, especially in a job like hers, where any encounter with law enforcement carried a heightened risk. Yet, here she was, with a police cruiser trailing her, its lights signaling her to pull over. Obediently, Lena maneuvered her car to the curb, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the reality of her situation sank in. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, though a sinking dread gnawed at her stomach. The faint rain continued to patter against her car as the police vehicle came to a halt behind her. The officers, 3 of them, stepped out, their imposing figures silhouetted against the harsh glow of the cruiser's headlights. Lena watched them approach through her side mirror, her mind racing with questions. She hadn't done anything wrong, of that she was certain. So why were they here? The first officer, a tall, heavy-set man with a look of hardened impatience on his face, knocked on her window. His voice, muffled by the glass and the steady drum of rain, was terse and authoritative. "License and registration," he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her face, as though he were looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. Lena nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew better than to make any sudden gestures. Reaching over to her glove compartment, she retrieved her registration and handed it to him, her fingers trembling slightly as she offered her driver's license as well. The officer took them without a word, his gaze never leaving her, and stepped back to examine the documents under the flickering streetlight. Seconds stretched into minutes as Lena sat alone in the silence, her heart pounding louder with each passing moment. The other 2 officers circled her car, their hands resting on their holsters, their eyes cold and unreadable. A gust of wind carried the murmur of a distant siren, the only sound punctuating the oppressive quiet that surrounded them. Then, just as Lena began to hope this might be a routine check, the officer returned, his face twisted into a scowl. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. A sharp pang of fear gripped her chest as Lena hesitated, her gaze darting between the officers. She knew she had no choice, refusing could only make things worse. But as she reached for the door handle and stepped out into the cold night, she felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on her, stripping her of any semblance of control. As Lena stood in the rain, her dark curls clinging to her face, the officers closed in around her. She felt a surge of indignation rise within her, tempered by a quiet, simmering anger. Why was this happening to her? She'd done nothing to warrant this treatment. But when she opened her mouth to speak, to ask what she'd done wrong, the officer nearest to her cut her off. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled disdain, "we have reason to believe you may be involved in some suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity," she repeated, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "I'm just a taxi driver. I've been working all day, just trying to get home." The officer sneered, his eyes flashing with something dark and ugly. "That's what they all say. We've had reports of increased activity in this area. And you just happen to be driving around late at night. Seems a bit convenient, don't you think?" Lena felt her pulse quicken, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about her, a black woman alone on a dark street, easy prey for their assumptions and prejudices. She forced herself to stay calm, though every fiber of her being screamed against the injustice of it all. "I've done nothing wrong," she said firmly, holding the officer's gaze. "I'd like to know why I'm being detained." The officer laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Detained? This isn't a detention," he said, stepping closer. "It's just a few questions. Nothing more. Unless you're hiding something." The implication was clear, and Lena's heart pounded as she realized the full extent of their intentions. She was alone, vulnerable, and entirely at their mercy. But she refused to let them see her fear. Squaring her shoulders, she met their stares with unwavering resolve. Back in the safety of her mind, Lena clung to a thought that brought her a sliver of comfort: David. Her husband. Her protector. The man who had dedicated his life to defending people like her. People who had been wronged and silenced. David was a formidable lawyer, known for his tenacity and his refusal to back down in the face of injustice. If there was anyone who could turn this nightmare into a fight for justice, it was him. But as the officers continued their line of questioning, peppering her with accusations and veiled threats, Lena knew she was on her own for now. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting for any sign of resistance, any excuse to escalate. And so she answered their questions, each word measured, each response a careful attempt to diffuse the tension. But inside, A storm was brewing, fueled by a righteous anger that burned hotter with every passing second. The night wore on, the rain intensifying as Lena stood in the glare of the police lights, her spirit unbroken even as the officers pushed her to the brink. She could feel the weight of the system bearing down on her, pressing her into a corner, stripping away her dignity. But she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She was stronger than they could ever know. And as she held her head high, a single thought echoed in her mind: they would pay for this. Every single one of them as the rain poured harder, soaking her to the bone. Lena's thoughts raced, each one tinged with a desperate longing for the nightmare to end. She stood, shivering under the police lights, clutching her damp jacket around her shoulders, the cold seeping into her skin. The officers remained relentless, their questions shifting from vague insinuations to blatant accusations. They asked her why she was out so late, who she'd been transporting, and even hinted that she might be involved in criminal activity. Every question was loaded, every word dripping with contempt. But Lena held firm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her intimidated. In the distance, she could see pedestrians hurrying by, heads down to avoid the rain, casting quick, uncomfortable glances toward her and the officers. No one stopped, no one asked if she needed help. It was as if she were invisible, swallowed up by the city's indifference. The thought stung, and Lena clenched her fists, willing herself to remain calm even as anger and frustration churned within her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, treated like a criminal, humiliated on a public street. And then, just when she felt the situation couldn't worsen, one of the officers stepped forward, a smug smile playing on his lips. He leaned in close, his voice low but laced with menace. "We could make this easier on you. You know," he said, his tone oily and suggestive. "If you just cooperate, answer a few more questions, maybe we won't have to take you downtown." The implication was clear. Lena's chest tightened, and she felt a surge of revulsion. She'd heard stories like this before. Tales of officers using intimidation to coerce innocent people, especially those who looked like her, into compliance. She thought of David, of all the times he'd come home, voice tight with anger as he recounted cases of abuse and misconduct he'd fought against in court. She thought of how tirelessly he'd worked to defend those who had been wrongly accused, those who had been silenced by a system that seemed determined to keep people like her at the margins. Summoning every ounce of strength, Lena met the officer's gaze, her voice steady and unwavering. "I've cooperated," she said, her tone measured. "I've answered your questions, and I'm not going anywhere with you." The officer's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. He stepped back, muttering something under his breath to his colleagues. They huddled together, casting glances at her, their expressions a mix of frustration and disdain. She could see them deliberating, weighing their next move, perhaps considering whether to take her into custody despite her innocence. Lena's heart pounded, her fear nearly overpowering her resolve. But just as she felt her courage faltering, she heard the faint, familiar ring of her phone from inside the taxi. It was David. With renewed determination, Lena turned back toward her car, her gaze never leaving the officers as she opened the door to retrieve her phone. She knew that answering it might provoke them, but she didn't care. David needed to know what was happening, needed to understand the severity of her situation. She held her breath as she raised the phone to her ear, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke his name. "David. I'm in trouble." On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause before his familiar, steady voice came through, calm yet laced with concern. "Lena? What's going on? Are you all right?" Lena's eyes darted to the officers, who were watching her with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. She lowered her voice, her words spilling out in a rush. I was pulled over. They're saying I'm involved in something. They won't let me go. David. I think they want to arrest me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, and Lena could almost picture him, his face set in grim determination. Stay calm, he said, his tone soothing but resolute. Don't say anything else. I'm coming. I'll be there as soon as I can. The call ended, and Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her. A lifeline in the storm. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her gaze returning to the officers, who were now muttering among themselves. She had no idea how long it would take David to reach her, but she knew he would come. He always did. And he would fight for her, just as he had fought for so many others. As she waited, the rain continued to pour, the city around her fading into a blur of lights and shadows. The officers, seemingly frustrated by her silence, finally decided to act. One of them stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Ma'am, you're under arrest, he said, his tone harsh, his gaze unapologetic. You're being detained for questioning in connection with a recent series of incidents. You have the right to remain silent. But his words were cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps. Lena turned, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, as a tall figure emerged from the shadows, a familiar figure, moving with purpose and authority. It was David, his eyes blazing with a fire that sent a chill down her spine. He looked directly at the officers, his expression cold, his jaw set in determination. Unhand my wife, he commanded, his voice low and powerful. The officers hesitated, clearly caught off guard by his sudden appearance and the unmistakable authority in his voice. David stepped closer, his gaze unwavering as he addressed them. Do you know who I am? He asked, his tone calm yet edged with steel. I'm David Johnson, attorney at law, and I would strongly advise you to reconsider what you're doing right now. One of the officers, the same one who had been questioning Lena, sneered. Look, sir, this isn't your business. We're conducting an investigation, and your wife here is a suspect. David's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My wife is no criminal, and you have no grounds to detain her. I suggest you step back before you find yourselves facing a lawsuit for unlawful detention and abuse of power. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The confidence they had displayed moments before was beginning to waver in the face of David's unwavering determination. Lena watched as her husband stood his ground, shielding her from the officer's hostility, his presence a beacon of hope in the darkness. After a tense silence, the lead officer finally relented, his expression sour. Fine. But don't think this is over, he muttered, glaring at David. We'll be in touch. With that, the officers retreated, their footsteps fading into the rain-soaked night as they returned to their cruiser. Lena felt a surge of relief as David wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe, her fear dissipating in the warmth of his embrace. Are you all right? He asked softly, brushing a stray curl from her face. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I am now. As they stood there, the rain pouring down around them, Lena realized that this wasn't over. The officers might have left, but the damage had been done. They had violated her rights, attempted to intimidate her, and humiliated her without cause. And she knew, without a doubt, that David would not let this stand. This was just the beginning of a fight for justice. For dignity. And for the countless others who had suffered in silence. David's hand tightened around hers. His eyes meeting hers with a fierce determination. "We're going to make them pay. Lena," he said. His voice filled with resolve. "They won't get away with this." And as they walked away, hand in hand, Lena felt a newfound strength rising within her. Fueled by the knowledge that she was not alone. She had David by her side. And together, they would face whatever battles lay ahead. This was their fight. And they would see it through to the end as Lena and David made their way back to their car. A heavy silence hung between them. Weighted by the events of the night. The adrenaline from the confrontation still coursed through Lena's veins, making her hands tremble slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She glanced at David. His gaze fixed firmly ahead. His jaw clenched in a way that she recognized well. He was furious. Not in a way that would erupt into shouting. But with a quiet, simmering rage that was more dangerous and more determined. "David," she began softly. Her voice shaky. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." He turned to her. His expression softening for a moment as he reached over and covered her hand with his. "You don't ever have to thank me for that, Lena," he replied. His tone warm but resolute. "They thought they could treat you like that because they assumed no one would stand up for you. They assumed wrong." They drove in silence for a while. The city lights casting fleeting shadows across the car interior as they sped through the rain-slicked streets. Lena leaned back. Her mind replaying the confrontation with the officers. The sense of helplessness she'd felt. The fear that had clutched her heart when they'd stepped toward her with handcuffs in hand. But now, with David by her side, that fear was transforming into something else, something stronger. She was ready to fight. Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small and powerless. As they reached home, Lena let out a deep breath, feeling the tension start to drain from her shoulders. Their cozy apartment was exactly as they had left it, filled with warmth and soft light. But tonight, it felt like a sanctuary. David hung up his coat, his face still a mask of resolve, as if he was already piecing together the strategy for what lay ahead. "Lena," he said, breaking the silence as they sat down on the couch. "We need to talk about what happened. I want every detail. Don't leave anything out." She nodded, recounting each moment, the flashing lights, the officers' hostile faces, the veiled threats, and finally, their attempt to intimidate her into compliance. As she spoke, she could see David's eyes darken, his fists clenching in barely restrained anger. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he processed her words. "This isn't just about tonight," he said finally, his voice low but intense. "This is a pattern. It's a system that's been built to make people like us feel powerless, to break us down bit by bit. But we're not going to let them get away with it. They think they can use their authority to control and intimidate, but they're wrong. What are we going to do?" Lena asked, a flicker of both fear and excitement dancing in her eyes. David leaned forward, his face inches from hers, a fierce determination burning in his gaze. "We're going to file a formal complaint. We're going to bring this to court. And I'm going to make sure every single person in that department knows that they can't get away with this. I'll gather witnesses, pull footage from nearby cameras if I have to, and make them answer for every second of what they did to you." Lena felt a surge of pride and gratitude wash over her as she listened to David speak. She knew how relentless he could be when it came to fighting for justice. He had taken on powerful corporations, corrupt officials, and oppressive laws, always standing tall for those who had no voice. And now, He was about to turn that same unwavering resolve toward the very officers who had tried to strip her of her dignity. The following day, David wasted no time. He spent hours at his office, poring over legal documents, pulling up city ordinances, and drafting the paperwork for the complaint. He made phone calls to colleagues, civil rights advocates, and media contacts, each conversation building momentum toward what he knew would be a difficult but necessary battle. Lena watched him work, a sense of awe mingling with her own determination. This was David at his best, unyielding, fearless, and methodical, driven by a sense of justice that would not be silenced. Meanwhile, Lena took steps of her own. She reached out to friends and fellow drivers, sharing her story and asking if they had ever experienced similar mistreatment. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of stories poured in, accounts of harassment, wrongful detentions, and the unchecked power that officers wielded over people who had no one to stand up for them. The weight of these stories fueled her resolve, igniting a fire within her to see this fight through to the end. Days turned into weeks, and the case grew, gaining attention not only from local media but from activists and advocacy groups across the city. David stood at the helm, his presence commanding respect as he held press conferences and spoke about the pervasive discrimination faced by Black citizens in the city. His words struck a chord, resonating with those who had been silent for too long. "Let's be clear," David said during one conference, his voice echoing through the crowded room. "This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a larger problem. A systemic issue that allows those in power to act with impunity. My wife was targeted because of her race, her profession, and her vulnerability as a lone woman on the road at night. This could happen to any one of us. And it has happened to countless others. But it stops here. It stops now." His words reverberated far beyond the press room, reaching people across the city who had felt the sting of injustice but had never had the chance to speak out. Lena could see the effect it was having on the community. People were standing up, sharing their stories, lending their voices to a cause that had been buried in silence for too long. As the trial date approached, the atmosphere in their apartment grew tense but purposeful. David worked late into the night, reviewing witness testimonies, compiling evidence, and preparing for what would be a pivotal moment not only for Lena but for everyone who had experienced the same kind of injustice. Lena knew the stakes were high, but she felt a calm determination settle over her. She was ready to face the officers in court, to tell her story, and to demand the respect and dignity that had been denied to her. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Supporters from the community filled the benches. Journalists lined the back row, and the officers involved sat at their table, their faces carefully blank. Lena glanced at them, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. She knew that they were part of a broken system, that they had been molded by it. But that didn't absolve them of their actions. They had chosen to abuse their power, and now they would be held accountable. David began his opening statement with a calm, measured tone that carried the weight of his conviction. He recounted the events of that night, his words painting a vivid picture of the fear and humiliation Lena had experienced. He described the officers' behavior, their attempts to intimidate and control, and the inherent bias that had led them to target her in the first place. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing clear and strong, "this case is about more than just one night. It's about a pattern of discrimination, a misuse of authority, and a failure to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or background. My wife was treated as less than human because of her skin color, her gender, and her profession. She was robbed of her dignity, her rights, and her safety by those sworn to protect her. Today, we seek justice, Not only for Lena but for every person who has been made to feel small and powerless by those who misuse their power. Lena watched, her heart swelling with pride, as David continued, laying out the evidence with a precision that left no room for doubt. She saw the jurors' faces shift, saw the weight of his words settling over them, and she felt a flicker of hope. This was the beginning of something bigger than herself. A battle not just for her dignity but for the dignity of countless others who had been silenced and oppressed. The trial lasted for days, each testimony building on the narrative of injustice, each piece of evidence reinforcing the truth of David's words. Witnesses came forward, recounting their own experiences, lending their voices to a cause that was growing stronger with each passing moment. When the final verdict was read, Lena felt a surge of relief and triumph wash over her. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, and the judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom as he condemned their actions and the systemic issues that had enabled them. It was a victory, not only for Lena and David but for the entire community. As they left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Lena felt a sense of peace settle over her. This battle was over, but the fight for justice would continue, fueled by the voices of those who refused to be silenced. David squeezed her hand, his face softened by a rare smile. "We did it," he whispered, pride shining in his eyes. And as they walked away from the courthouse, Lena knew they had not only claimed justice for themselves but had ignited a spark of hope for everyone who had ever felt powerless. Together, they had shown that courage, resilience, and unity could overcome even the most deeply rooted injustices. The day after the verdict, Lena and David found themselves inundated with messages of support. Calls, emails, and letters flooded in from people across the city, strangers who had heard Lena's story and felt compelled to reach out. Some shared their own stories of injustice, small and large alike. Others simply wanted to thank Lena and David for having the courage to stand up and fight, for being voices in a system that often silenced them. Lena sat by the window of their small living room, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she read through the messages. Each one felt like a spark, igniting a new determination within her. This battle had started as something personal, but it had quickly grown into something far larger than she'd ever imagined. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. David joined her, holding a stack of letters that had arrived that morning. He smiled, watching the emotion play across her face as she read. "They believe in you, Lena. They believe in us. We've started something here, something that won't be easy for anyone to ignore." Lena nodded, her eyes reflecting both the weight of this responsibility and the fire it had sparked in her. "Then let's make it something that can't be forgotten. Let's make sure that this fight isn't just a moment but a movement." Within days, they began organizing community meetings, gatherings where people could come to share their own stories of encounters with a system that had failed them. At first, the meetings were small, held in church basements or community centers, with people sitting in tight circles, each one a little hesitant to speak. But as Lena and David shared their story, as they listened and offered their support, others began to open up. Each story was different, yet connected by a common thread: the feeling of being powerless, of facing a system that seemed to exist solely to oppress rather than protect. At one of these meetings, a woman named Carla stood up. Her voice was trembling, but her gaze was steady as she recounted her experience. "I've been a nurse for over 20 years. But one night, after a double shift, I was pulled over just a few blocks from my home. They said I matched a description of someone they were looking for. I showed them my ID, my credentials. But it didn't matter. They kept me there for over an hour, searching my car, questioning me, treating me like a criminal. I've been too scared to drive at night ever since." The room was silent, heavy with a shared understanding that transcended words. Lena reached out, clasping Carla's hand in her own, her gaze unwavering. "You're not alone," she said softly, her words carrying a conviction that resonated deeply. "None of us are alone in this." The gatherings grew, drawing not only those who had experienced similar injustices but also those who wanted to help. Lawyers, journalists, activists, and community leaders began to attend, offering their support and resources. David, with his legal expertise, began mentoring younger lawyers who wanted to take on cases of police misconduct and civil rights violations. Lena found herself at the forefront of a movement she hadn't expected to lead, her voice becoming a rallying cry for change. The media began to take notice, and soon, their movement was making headlines. Lena found herself on the front page of newspapers, her story and her words spreading far beyond the city. She was invited to speak at community events, at universities, even on national television. Each time, she spoke with a clear purpose, using her own experience as a call to action, urging people to stand up and demand accountability. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and interviews, Lena and David sat together on their small balcony, looking out over the city lights. There was a quiet, comfortable silence between them, a moment of peace amid the chaos they had willingly stepped into. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we just let it go?" Lena asked softly, her gaze distant as she traced the city skyline with her eyes. David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. But then I think about all the people we've met, their stories, their strength. I think about Carla, and all the others who've been through so much worse than we have. If we had let it go, who would have been there for them?" Lena nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I don't regret it," she whispered. "Not for a second." Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a news producer with a major network, asking if she would be willing to come in for an interview. They wanted her to talk about her journey, about the movement she and David had built from the ground up. The thought of speaking on a national platform was daunting, but Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Looks like we're going to be even busier," she said, showing David the message with a small smile. He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You were made for this, Lena. You have a voice that people want to listen to. Don't be afraid to use it." The following week, Lena found herself sitting in a brightly lit television studio, the cameras trained on her as she spoke. The interviewer asked about her experience, about the trial, and about the movement she had inspired. Lena spoke openly, her voice steady and clear, sharing not only her story but the stories of those who had come forward to join her cause. She spoke about the need for accountability, for reform, for a system that served all people, not just a select few. As the interview wrapped up, the host leaned forward, her expression warm and genuine. "Lena, you've become a powerful voice for so many people who feel unheard. What do you want them to know? Above all else?" Lena paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want them to know that they have power, that they have a voice," she said. "I want them to know that they don't have to face these battles alone. And I want them to know that change is possible. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But together, we can build a world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality for everyone." The screen faded to black, but the impact of her words lingered, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Messages of support poured in, and donations to their movement skyrocketed, enabling Lena and David to expand their efforts. They set up a fund to provide legal aid for individuals who couldn't afford representation, established partnerships with civil rights organizations, and worked tirelessly to push for policy reforms at both the local and national levels. But for Lena, the most meaningful moments continued to be the gatherings with the community. The meetings where people could share their stories, find comfort, and draw strength from one another. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the battles would be many. But she was ready. She had found her purpose, her calling, and she was determined to see it through. One night, as she stood at yet another community meeting, looking out at the crowd of faces before her, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The journey had been painful, but it had led her to this moment, surrounded by people who believed in the same vision she and David had fought so hard to create. She took a deep breath, her voice ringing out with confidence as she addressed the crowd. We are here because we refuse to be silenced. We are here because we believe in a future where justice is not a privilege but a right. And we will not stop until that future becomes a reality. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of solidarity that echoed through the room. And as Lena looked out at the sea of faces, she knew they were all in this together. This was not just her fight, it was theirs. And together, they would change the world. Months passed, and Lena's movement had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a single voice fighting against an injustice had become a powerful chorus, demanding change. Lena found herself traveling across the country, meeting with other activists, speaking at rallies, and sharing her story with communities that had long felt unheard. Her days were packed with meetings, interviews, and speeches. Her nights spent preparing for the next battle. It was exhausting, but she was driven by a purpose greater than herself. But with every step forward came new challenges. The opposition had grown louder, and not everyone celebrated her newfound voice. She faced constant scrutiny from both the media and the institutions she was challenging. Her inbox was flooded with hate mail alongside messages of support, and her every move was analyzed, criticized, dissected. At times, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her, demanding that she be more, do more, fight harder. Late one evening, Lena sat in her office, a single desk lamp illuminating stacks of papers and letters sprawled across her desk. David entered quietly, watching her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You need rest, Lena, he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You can't carry this alone. Lena looked up at him, her eyes weary but determined. I know, she whispered, her voice soft. But there's so much to do. So many people depending on us. I can't just stop. David knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. Lena, you've done incredible things. You've inspired thousands, maybe millions. But you're only human. You need to take care of yourself if you're going to keep this going. She sighed, leaning into his embrace, letting his strength steady her. She had been running on adrenaline and purpose, but she knew he was right. She had to find balance, to remember that even as she fought for others, she needed to care for herself. Together, they decided to take a short break. They retreated to a small, quiet cabin in the mountains, far from the noise and demands of the city. For the first time in months, Lena found herself breathing deeply, letting the crisp mountain air clear her mind. She spent her days hiking, reading, and simply being present. It was a strange feeling, this stillness. But it reminded her of why she had started this journey, to bring peace, fairness, and dignity to people's lives. One afternoon, as she stood on the cabin's porch watching the sunset, Her phone buzzed. She hesitated. Then picked it up. Her heart leaping as she saw a message from Carla. One of the first people who had come forward in their movement. Lena. I did it. I spoke out. I shared my story at the rally today. It was terrifying. But I felt so free. Thank you for giving me the courage to do this. We're with you. Every step of the way. Tears pricked at Lena's eyes as she read the message. A profound sense of pride swelling within her. She thought of all the people she'd met. The stories they'd shared. The battles they were fighting. Each one a testament to their resilience. She wasn't just leading a movement, she was part of something larger. A tapestry of voices and stories woven together by hope and courage. When she returned to the city, Lena felt renewed. Her spirit fortified. She and David plunged back into their work with a fresh sense of purpose. Tackling new cases. Meeting with legislators. Pushing for policy changes that would protect vulnerable communities. They organized marches. Held public forums. And continued to rally support from all corners of society. Lena became a familiar face on news broadcasts. Her voice a beacon for those seeking justice. But as the movement grew, so did the threats. There were attempts to intimidate her. Anonymous messages warning her to stay quiet, to know her place. She was followed by unmarked cars. Her phone calls sometimes intercepted by strange clicks and silence. Friends and allies expressed concern, urging her to be cautious. Yet Lena remained undeterred. Her resolve only growing stronger. If they were trying to silence her, it was because they feared her impact. One evening, after a particularly heated public meeting, Lena received a call from a senator who had been watching her rise closely. His voice was serious, yet respectful. Lena, he began. I want you to know that what you're doing is admirable. But you're walking a dangerous line. There are powerful people who feel threatened by this movement. Be careful. The higher you rise, the more they'll try to bring you down. Lena thanked him for his concern. But her mind was made up. She had come too far. Endured too much. To turn back now. She knew the risks. But she also knew the stakes. If she backed down, if she allowed fear to silence her, then everything she had worked for would be in vain. As she continued to lead, she found strength not only in herself but in the community she had helped build. People she had once inspired were now inspiring her. Stepping up to lead their own initiatives. Organizing events. And rallying for change in their own neighborhoods. The movement had become something far greater than Lena herself. A self-sustaining force of resilience and hope. Months later, as Lena stood before a crowd at a massive rally, she took a deep breath, looking out at the thousands of faces, each one filled with expectation, gratitude, and unwavering determination. She could feel the energy, the power of collective resolve. Raising her voice, she began to speak, her words resonating across the crowd, carried by the weight of every story she'd heard, every struggle she'd witnessed. Today, we stand together, she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. We're here because we believe in justice, in equality, in a future where everyone's voice is heard. They tried to silence us, to make us feel small. But look around. We are not small. We are not alone. And we will not be silenced. The crowd erupted. A thunderous wave of applause and cheers that reverberated through the streets, echoing through the city and beyond. Lena felt a surge of pride, her heart swelling as she looked out at the sea of people who had come to stand by her side. This was her purpose, her calling. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would continue to fight for as long as it took. For Lena, the journey had only just begun. She knew there would be more challenges. More battles. But she was ready. She had become a symbol of hope. A voice for those who had none. And she would carry that torch forward, lighting the way for generations to come. And as the sun began to set over the city, casting a warm glow over the crowd, Lena felt a profound sense of peace. They were united, strong, and unbreakable. Together, they were unstoppable as Lena's movement grew. The quiet stability of her life transformed into a whirlwind. Her phone was constantly buzzing with messages from supporters, reporters, and community leaders who wanted to meet. She spent her days moving from one engagement to the next. Her schedule packed with speeches, interviews, and strategy meetings. Every day brought new faces, new stories, and new people looking to her for hope. Yet, as the movement gained national attention, she began to notice the subtle but growing tension between herself and the world she was challenging. One evening, she returned home late. Her shoulders slumped from exhaustion. David was waiting for her in the kitchen, a gentle smile on his face, his eyes filled with pride and concern. He handed her a cup of tea as she sank into the chair, a sigh escaping her lips. "You've been working non-stop," David said, studying her with quiet intensity. "You're making a huge difference, Lena. But you need to pace yourself." Lena took a sip of tea, feeling its warmth spread through her. "I know," she said softly, looking into her husband's eyes. "It's just, every time I speak to someone new, I see how much they need this. They need someone to believe in. And if I don't keep pushing, I feel like I'm letting them down." David nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "You don't have to carry this alone. Look around, you've inspired so many people. It's okay to lean on them, too." His words settled over her like a balm, easing the tightness in her chest. She knew he was right. She had people who would stand by her, who wanted to help carry the weight. But the drive to keep pushing, to make every day count, was fierce within her. This movement had become her mission, her purpose. Every injustice she had witnessed, every tear she had wiped away, strengthened her resolve. In the days that followed, Lena continued her work. But she began to share more of the responsibilities with her growing team. She enlisted the help of young activists, lawyers, and volunteers from the community, delegating tasks and empowering others to lead. Together, they held workshops on civil rights, trained people to advocate for themselves, and organized town hall meetings to hold local officials accountable. With each event, Lena felt a sense of pride and gratitude. This wasn't just her movement anymore. It belonged to everyone who had suffered, hoped, and fought for change. Yet, as the movement expanded, Lena began to notice a darker undercurrent. She started receiving anonymous letters, some filled with vitriol, others with veiled threats. There were phone calls in the middle of the night, just a few seconds of silence before the line went dead. She dismissed the first few incidents as the work of a few disgruntled people. But as the harassment continued, a knot of fear began to form in her stomach. David urged her to be careful, to take precautions. But Lena, stubborn and determined, refused to be intimidated. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let fear hold her back. She would face the threats head-on, just as she had faced everything else in her life. Then, one evening, as she was leaving a rally in a neighboring city, she noticed a car following her. She tried to shake it, taking turns through narrow streets. But the car stayed close, its headlights glaring in her rearview mirror. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart pounding as she fought to keep her mind calm. After a tense few minutes, the car finally turned off, disappearing down a side street. But the experience left her shaken. When she returned home that night, she found herself unable to sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had always known there would be risks in challenging a system that so many wanted to protect. But this was different. This was personal, targeted, and it left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. In the morning, she shared the incident with David, who listened quietly, his face a mixture of worry and anger. "Lena, this isn't just about the movement anymore," he said, his voice taut with concern. "They're trying to scare you. They want you to stop." She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "Then we're doing something right," she replied, a steely determination in her voice. "If they're afraid of us, it means we're making a difference. And I won't let them intimidate me into silence." David sighed, knowing that nothing he could say would sway her. Lena's courage was one of the things he loved most about her. But he also feared for her. He knew the path she had chosen was fraught with dangers. And while he would stand by her side, he worried about what lay ahead. As the months went on, the threats continued. But Lena learned to ignore them, focusing on her work instead. The movement was gaining traction, and she had secured meetings with influential legislators who were beginning to take her demands for reform seriously. She and her team worked tirelessly to draft proposals, hoping to implement changes in police accountability, community outreach, and support for marginalized communities. Then, one day, she received a call from Carla, the nurse she had helped empower to share her story. Carla's voice was filled with excitement, and Lena could hear the emotion in her words. "Lena," she said, barely able to contain her joy, "I spoke with the city council today. They're implementing changes, policies to protect against racial profiling. Mandatory training for officers. It's happening. Lena, you did this." Tears pricked at Lena's eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with pride. This was the impact she had dreamed of, the change she had fought so hard to create. But as Carla continued speaking, Lena felt a pang of sadness. She knew this battle was far from over. The policies were a step in the right direction, but there was still so much work to be done. As the movement continued to grow, Lena's voice became one of the most powerful in the country. She was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before Congress, and to share her story with a nation that was finally beginning to wake up to the injustices that had long been ignored. She became a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that one person could spark a revolution. But with her newfound influence came even greater challenges. She faced backlash from powerful figures who saw her as a threat to their status quo. She was portrayed as a radical, an agitator, someone who was disrupting the peace. The media began to paint her as divisive, questioning her motives, her background, and even her personal life. She was scrutinized in a way she had never anticipated. Every word she spoke twisted and taken out of context. There were days when the weight of it all felt crushing, when she wanted to retreat, to find solace in the quiet life she had left behind. But each time, she remembered the faces of those she was fighting for, the people who had shared their stories with her, who had trusted her to speak for them. She knew she couldn't give up, not now. Not ever. One evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings, Lena found herself alone in a quiet park near her home. She sat on a bench, looking out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling against the darkening sky. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment, a sense of both peace and restlessness. She was proud of what she had accomplished, but she knew there was so much more to do. As she sat there, A young woman approached her, hesitating before taking a seat on the bench beside her. The woman looked nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap. But there was a look of determination in her eyes. "Are you Lena?" she asked, her voice soft. Lena nodded, offering the woman a warm smile. "Yes. That's me. How can I help you?" The young woman took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. I wanted to say thank you. I've been following your work, and you've given me the courage to stand up for myself. I used to think my voice didn't matter, that no one would listen. But because of you, I believe that I can make a difference." Lena felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. This was why she fought. Why she endured the hardships and the backlash. It was for people like this young woman. People who had felt invisible, powerless, and alone. "Thank you," Lena replied, her voice filled with emotion. "But remember, this movement isn't just about me. It's about all of us. You have a voice, too. And it's just as important as mine. Together, we're unstoppable." They sat in silence for a while, sharing a moment of quiet solidarity. Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. A reminder that her journey was part of something much larger than herself. The movement was bigger than any one person. And it would continue, with or without her. As Lena returned home that night, she felt a profound sense of peace. She knew there would be more battles, more challenges. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had inspired a generation to stand up, to speak out, to demand change. And no matter what lay ahead, she was ready to face it. Because in her heart, she knew that the fight for justice was worth every sacrifice, every hardship. She had found her calling, her purpose, and she would continue to walk this path, knowing that each step brought them closer to a world where everyone's voice could be heard. As Lena's movement grew into a national force, she began to realize the full scope of the impact she was having, not just on her community but across the country. People were rallying behind her message, organizing marches in cities she had never even visited, and sending letters of support from places she'd only heard of. It was inspiring, yet humbling, to see how far her voice had reached. One weekend, Lena and David were invited to speak at a summit in Washington, D.C. It was a gathering of activists, policymakers, and influential leaders dedicated to tackling social issues from every angle. Lena's movement had gained enough recognition that people wanted to hear her ideas, to understand the path she envisioned for lasting change. It was a chance to advocate not just for reforms but for a complete reimagining of how the justice system could work for everyone. As she stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, she felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. No matter how many speeches she had given, the anticipation of speaking never felt routine. David was beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder in silent support. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the warmth of his presence. They exchanged a glance, and he smiled reassuringly, his eyes filled with pride and encouragement. "Remember," he whispered, leaning close, "you're here because your voice matters. Every single person in that audience wants to hear what you have to say." Lena nodded, straightening her shoulders as she stepped onto the stage. The audience was vast, rows of faces looking up at her with anticipation and respect. She scanned the crowd, pausing for a moment to take in the gravity of the moment. She began her speech, her voice steady, her words carefully chosen. "What we're fighting for," she said, her voice resonating through the hall, "is more than just accountability. We're fighting for dignity, for the right of every individual to be treated as a human being, regardless of their background, their race, or their profession. We're fighting to ensure that no one is seen as less deserving of respect or justice. As she spoke, she could see nods of agreement, hear the murmurs of approval ripple through the crowd. She shared stories from her journey, highlighting the people she had met, the battles they had fought, and the victories they had won together. Each story brought the message closer to the audience, making it impossible to ignore the humanity behind the movement. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Lena felt a surge of emotion, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had poured her heart into this mission, and to see it resonate so deeply was both empowering and humbling. As she stepped off the stage, David embraced her, his arms warm and strong around her. "You are amazing," he murmured, pride evident in his voice. "You're changing the world, Lena." But despite the triumph of the summit, Lena knew that the journey was far from over. In the days that followed, she received invitations to join panels, attend meetings with influential figures, and collaborate with organizations focused on criminal justice reform. The movement had momentum, and people were eager to work with her. However, she found herself faced with difficult choices about how to navigate the attention, the media spotlight, and the numerous opportunities that came with her growing influence. One evening, as she and David walked through their neighborhood, she voiced her concerns. "It's like a new world, David. One that's filled with so much possibility. But it's overwhelming. I started this fight to help people like me, people in our community who needed a voice. But now, it feels like I'm being pulled in a million directions." David listened intently, his face thoughtful. "The more change you inspire, the more people will want you to lead," he said. "But you don't have to say yes to everything. Stay true to why you started this journey. Focus on what aligns with your values." Lena nodded, finding comfort in his words. She knew he was right. This movement had to remain rooted in authenticity. She didn't want to be a symbol without substance. She wanted her work to make a real difference, to touch people's lives in tangible ways. Over time, Lena refined her focus, choosing her battles carefully. She collaborated with legislators to propose bills that aimed to address police accountability, pushing for policies that would prevent abuses of power. She worked with local leaders to implement programs for community policing, where officers were trained to understand and engage with the neighborhoods they served. And, in collaboration with her team, she developed educational initiatives aimed at young people, teaching them about their rights and how to advocate for themselves. One day, she received a letter from a high school student named Marcus. He wrote about how he'd always felt targeted, how he'd grown up afraid of law enforcement and distrusting authority figures. But after hearing about Lena's work, he had found the courage to organize a group at his school focused on community justice. He thanked her for showing him that his voice mattered, that he had the power to create change. Lena felt tears prick her eyes as she read Marcus's letter. She realized that this was the true heart of her work, not just confronting the system but empowering the next generation to be unafraid, to believe in their own ability to make a difference. She wrote back to Marcus, encouraging him to keep going, to keep fighting for what was right. As time passed, Lena's impact only deepened. She became a mentor to young activists, guiding them, sharing her experiences, and watching with pride as they took up the mantle of leadership. She saw herself in them, the same determination, the same hope, the same fire. And each of them, in turn, inspired her, reminded her of the reasons she had embarked on this path. But amid the victories, there were also moments of heartache. She encountered setbacks, resistance from those who sought to protect the status quo, and disappointment when some reforms faced delays or were watered down by political pressures. Each setback weighed on her, testing her resilience, her faith in the work she was doing. She found solace in the support of her community, in the strength of those who stood by her side. But the challenges were constant reminders of the uphill battle she faced. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Lena and David sat together in the quiet of their living room. The weight of the journey was heavy on her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion, the strain of carrying so many hopes on her shoulders. "Sometimes, I wonder if it will ever be enough," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I wonder if we'll ever see the change we're fighting for." David took her hand, his gaze warm and steady. "Lena, you've already changed so much. Every person you've inspired, every life you've touched, it all matters. You may not be able to fix everything overnight, but that doesn't mean your work isn't powerful." She looked into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his words fill her heart. In that moment, she realized that the journey itself was just as important as the destination. Each step forward, each story shared, each life touched, they were all pieces of a greater whole. A movement that would continue to grow, even beyond her lifetime. With renewed resolve, Lena leaned into David's embrace, feeling his strength steady her once again. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had a community, a family, and a purpose that anchored her. That gave her the strength to keep going. The following morning, Lena returned to her work with a newfound sense of peace. She was ready to continue the fight. Not because she needed to win every battle, but because she believed in the power of every small step, every individual story, every voice that joined hers in calling for justice. Her movement had grown beyond her wildest dreams, but she knew it was only the beginning. And as she looked to the future, she felt a quiet certainty that one day, the world would change. It might take years, decades, even generations. But she had planted the seeds, and she would nurture them with every ounce of her strength. Because, in the end, Lena's fight was not just about her own story, it was about a vision of a world where everyone could stand tall, where justice was more than a promise, where dignity was a birthright. And for that vision, she would keep fighting. No matter how long it took. Lena's journey had started as a personal fight for justice, but it evolved into something far greater, a movement that united voices from across the country, igniting a spark in countless others. Through every challenge, Lena remained unwavering, driven by her belief in a world where dignity and respect were universal rights. Her influence stretched beyond her community, inspiring a generation to stand up for what was right and empowering young people to believe in their ability to create change. The policies she helped implement, the lives she touched, and the people she mentored formed a legacy that would carry on her vision long after her work was done. Lena knew the road to justice would be long, but she had planted seeds of hope that would continue to grow, nurtured by those she inspired. Standing before a crowd of supporters one last time, Lena looked out and saw not just followers but leaders, each one ready to carry the torch forward. And with a heart full of gratitude, she smiled, knowing that, together, they were building a world where justice and compassion would prevail. This, she knew, was only the beginning.